Hello? Now? Hello? Can you hear me? Oh, great. Some more? How is that? Is that better? Way in the back? Okay, great. Thank you. Hi, welcome. It's so great to see all of you. You're in the right tent at the right time. We have the AC working, which is really exciting on a day like this. And what's even more exciting is we have Geraldine Brooks, one of the best writers working today. So I'm Kathy Blackwell. I'm an executive editor at Texas Monthly Magazine. And before we start, I want to do a few housekeeping things. Right after this is over, Geraldine will head right to the signing tent. And if you would like to have your book signed, chat with her for a minute, that's where we want to do that. So she'll head right there after this at 2:45. The signing starts. And silence your cell phones. But please feel free to take photos and, of her and tag the book festival and spread the word. And anyway, so I'm really excited. Let's go ahead and get started. So Australian-born Geraldine Brooks is a former Wall Street Journal foreign correspondent. She is an acclaimed author known for her immersive, character-driven historical novels. Her fiction debut, Year of Wonders, A Novel of the Plague, was published in 10 countries. Her second novel, March, was awarded a little prize we like to call the Pulitzer back in 2006. That was her second novel. Her other novels are People of the Book, Caleb's Crossing, and The Second Chord, about the fascinating life of King David. Geraldine is also the author of 2 works of nonfiction. She was a fellow at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Studies at Harvard University and was the recipient of the Dayton Literary, I don't have my glasses on, hold on. I was trying to do this. I'm like, wow, I can see better. Peace Prize for Lifetime Achievement. Her latest historical release, Horse, my beloved copy right here, is about a racehorse and racism in both the Civil War era and present times. It just won, maybe earlier this month, an Anisfeld Wolf Book Award presented for literature that confronts racism and explores diversity. So please, one more time, join me in welcoming Geraldine Brooks. So Geraldine will read from her book in just a minute, but before we do that, we kind of want to set the scene. Geraldine, you began your career as a journalist, and I know from what I understand of all your books all your novels that you've written so far, they usually stem from a moment when you uncover something that you just want to know more about, kind of like your aha moment or what have you. What was that for Horse? How did this book come about?
So I came late to horses. I grew up in the inner city of Sydney, and the only horse I ever saw was the mounted police when they would go through our fairly densely settled urban neighborhood. And it was kind of a mixed blessing because for my mother, the sound of the horse's hooves on the pavement was her signal to grab the dustpan, run out into the road, and see if she could score some manure for her rose bushes, which was pretty mortifying for a teenager. But so I managed to cruise through my life admiring them from a distance because I loved all animals, but not ever thinking of myself as somebody who could have a relationship with one. And this was unfortunate because if you're going to become horse crazy, it's much better to do it at 5 or 15 than at 50. But I became horse crazy at 50. And it happened because I was at a writer's retreat that happened to be being held on a ranch outside Santa Fe. And they had a corral full of beautiful Appaloosa and paint horses right outside my room. And I was admiring them one day, and the wrangler said, "You should come for a trail ride." And I said, "I can't ride." And he said, "Yes, you can. These horses know their job. They won't let you fall off." And so I believed him, and I went for this trail ride, and it was an ecstatic experience. And I got home, and about 3 days later, a young friend was over for dinner, and I was telling her how much I had enjoyed cantering through these red arroyos and what a great experience. I couldn't believe I hadn't done it before. And she looked out the window and she said, "You've got some land here. You could have a horse. In fact, I could give you my horse. A gift horse." Oh boy, there were so many questions that I should have asked, but I didn't. And I started learning to ride, and I'm waiting for this horse to come because this horse was not close by. This horse was in Mexico. But I didn't care because she was a beautiful horse, and I knew this because she was in a TV commercial. It was a commercial for a fast-acting cream to treat vaginal yeast infections. So you have to imagine this commercial. Look, Palomino galloping across the Mexican Altiplano, and the voiceover says, "Some things should be fast." Anyway, I became obsessed with this horse. It was all I wanted to think about. And my free horse turned out to be a very expensive proposition, as horses do, because it wasn't just the horse. It was fencing the property and converting a shed into a stall. And then, of course, you can't have one horse. So then the second horse came, and nobody could find me because I was either at a riding lesson or at the orthopedic surgeon's office. And I wasn't getting any work done. And this was starting to become a problem because there's a lot of money going out to farriers and saddle fitters and horse intuitives and horse masseurs, and not a lot coming in. And then I had a very lucky break because I was invited to a fundraising lunch at Plymouth Pawtuxet Museum. And at the same lunch was a guy from the Smithsonian Institution in Washington. And he was regaling the table with how he had just delivered the skeleton of the most famous racehorse of the 19th century from a dusty attic in the Natural History Museum to pride of place at the International Museum of the Horse in Kentucky, where this horse was telling the story of why Kentucky became the center of the thoroughbred industry, and much of it rested on this horse and the incredible stud sire that he became after his racing career. And I'm leaning forward. I am really riveted by this. And then he gets to the bit about what happened to the horse during the Civil War. And I know I have my next novel. And luckily it saved the family finances.
That was an amazing answer, by the way. It took me to places I wasn't expecting to go. So you get that feeling, you know you want to do this. So what did your research look like from that point?
Well, I thought I was just going to be writing this wonderful story about a racehorse, but the minute I started on the research, I encountered the people who were responsible for the success of this horse. And they were enslaved or formerly enslaved, highly skilled horse experts. And I learned that the racing industry in the 19th century, which was a huge deal. It was bigger than the NFL is now. It was a national obsession. It was like the NFL if we all went home and put on our helmet and pads and went out and played football, because everybody had a horse. It was an agrarian society, and people liked racing their workhorses up and down the main streets of towns. And everybody was obsessed with these magnificent match races between these thoroughbreds who had not only blistering speed, but also incredible endurance, because they would race for 4 miles, maybe twice or 3 times in the one day. So this is a different kind of racing. If you're racing 4 miles, that's like 3 Kentucky Derbies, and we think of that as a long race. So there's a lot more tactics and a lot more skill. And so once I understood that all this wealth and prestige was built on the plundered labor of enslaved black horsemen, I knew that it wasn't just going to be a book about a racehorse, it was going to be a book about race as well. And so that meant plunging into, luckily, you know, the incredible work of black historians who have done so much research into the system of enslavement and the details of life and what marriage meant and what the economic arrangements were and the gradations that affected people in terms of the value that they added from their labor and expertise. So I was delving into that. And I also knew that I wanted to have a contemporary story around the science of the bones at the Smithsonian. So I went to the Smithsonian. Many people here have probably been to the beautiful museums on the Mall, but that is only 2% of the Smithsonian's collections. 98% of what the Smithsonian has is in a huge campus out in suburban Maryland. And out there are all kinds of research done on the art that human beings have created, and they have specimens of every species that has been identified. So there is all kinds of science and artistic restoration going on out there. It is an incredible place. And I went out there to visit the very funky corner of it called the Osteo Prep Lab, where they deal with bones. And it is kind of stuck away, because if you're going to get bones ready for scientists to study, it usually starts with a dead animal, and they can be a little bit pungent. And I learned to my astonishment that for all the high-tech scientific equipment they had out there, the real work is still done by bugs. Bugs have to eat the flesh off the bones before the scientists can do their DNA research and all the other things. So while I was out there, the story took yet another turn, because a curator from the art museum said, "We've got a portrait of the horse that you're interested in. Would you like to see it?" And she took me to the study center where they keep paintings that aren't on public display. And there's this 19th century oil painting of the horse Lexington. And I said, did it come to the museum with the skeleton in the 19th century? And she said, no, much more recently. And weirdly, she's looking down, she said, that's odd. It came in this bequest of the edgiest contemporary art from post-World War II period, a feminist pioneering art gallery owner named Martha Jackson, who had been an early supporter of Pollock and de Kooning and gave Bridget Riley her first exhibit in America. And yet she has this one thing in her collection that is this traditional 19th century oil painting. So why did Martha Jackson have that? So then the story takes another turn that I didn't expect. So the research is going in so many different directions.
Right, and it ends up with you focusing on a character. You only know his name from the painting, Jarrett. A lot of the characters in your book, you mentioned Martha Jackson, some of the racehorse owners are real, as in all your books, real people. Jarrett, you didn't really know anything about Jarrett. So can you talk a little bit about how he's really the heart of the book. Yeah. How you decided to kind of create his character, and what did you base that on?
So once I started looking at the portraits of the horse, I found that also in the portraits, often the black horsemen are painted, and they're extraordinary portraits because they are portraits of individuals who are shown with great authority and enormous dignity and individuality. And this is very unusual in white artists' depictions of enslaved people. You do not see this in other paintings. So I was really struck by it. And so one of the paintings that's often described that is missing, so I didn't actually see the painting, but there's a description of a painting of Lexington in his old age, being led out by Black Jarrett, his groom. And I know, as somebody who knows horses, that the groom is the guy. The groom is the most important person. That is the footstep that the horse will recognize when it comes in the barn, because the groom's the one there in the morning with the feed. The groom is the one bandaging and bathing the legs and brushing and spending time and sleeping in the stall if the horse is sick. So I knew that the fundamental relationship for Lexington would be with his groom, and that was Jarrett. But who was Jarrett? So I started looking for him in the historical record, and I could find just traces of him. You can see, like, after the Emancipation Proclamation, at the farm where Lexington then was in Kentucky, Jarrett starts getting paid. So he's there in the pay records, and then he's there in the correspondence between the horse owners. Indirectly, it says, the darky groom will be bringing Lexington from Natchez to New Orleans. And I kind of feel that that's Jarrett. So I start looking for other Black horsemen whose lives were better documented. And you can find traces of these men in the correspondence between the thoroughbred owners. And again, it is very different, because most of the times when these enslavers are talking about their enslaved people, they're doing it in a very, like, dismissive way, or, you know, condescending, or just, you know, creepy. But when they're talking about their horsemen, it's not. They're deferring to the expertise of these men, because everything that mattered to them, their prestige and the wealth that came from these horses, rested on these men. And so it's a very different kind of way of acknowledging their deference to them. So I found that fascinating.
Yeah, and I think that might be a good place for you to maybe read a little bit of Jarrett's story from a passage.
So the artist for that portrait that I saw at the Smithsonian was a guy called Thomas J. Scott. And he's a very interesting guy. He didn't start off as an artist. He wanted to he was at medical school, but he couldn't afford it. And so he became a pharmacist, but he loved horse racing. And he then went to study under another equestrian painter called Troy. And he became an itinerant artist and a writer about thoroughbred horses. And he traveled around Kentucky and other areas in the South, painting these thoroughbreds. So it was kind of, it was a mixture of art and commerce, because people used these paintings to advertise their beautiful horses as stud sires or brood mares. And also, you know, if they wanted to sell the horses, so they would make etchings from these paintings. So he painted Lexington a number of times, and I've imagined his first meeting with Jarrett when Lexington was still a foal in Kentucky, and I'll just read you a little bit of the conversation. So he's asked Jarrett about a particular horse and what the horse is like. Thank you, says Scott. That helps me a good deal in thinking how to paint him. Jarrett wasn't in the habit of questioning his seniors, especially white people. They didn't tend to appreciate it, but he was powerfully curious. How does it do that? Scott smiled. Why do you think men like these thoroughbreds so much? Money, I guess, Jarrett replied. Well, sometimes they make money, but hardly ever nearly enough to make up for what most folks spend on them. So there's got to be something more. They're beautiful? Of course, they are beautiful, and men with money like to have beautiful things. Beautiful estates, beautiful wives, Scott smiled. But I can tell you, and it's a fact, many a horse-owning gentleman will pay me $50 or $60 for a painting of his horse, but he'd grudge to spend half that on a portrait of his wife, no matter how beautiful she might be. Jarrett kicked at the dirt. then maybe it's the races. Folk get excited to go there. All kind of folk, high and low. Scott nodded. All men are equal on the turf or under it. That's the saying. But the folk who own the horses, it's much more for them than an exciting day out. Here's the ground of it as I see it. A racehorse is a mirror, and a man sees his own reflection there. He wants to think he's from the best breeding. He wants to think himself brave. Can he win against all comers? And if not, does he have self-mastery to take a loss, stay cool in defeat, and try again undaunted? Those are the qualities of a great racehorse and a great gentleman. A gentleman likes to have a horse that gives the right answers to those questions. Then he can believe that he will give the right answers too. To do my part, I have to give a man a likeness that shows not just how beautiful the horse looks, but how beautiful it feels to him. Scott's words struck Jarrett like a bell clapper, and the truth of it rang through him. Maybe you don't need to be no gentleman to feel that, he said. That foal, he makes me feel hopeful, like the future is going to matter more than it did the day before he came.
So in the book, you write about Jarrett. You also have, in modern times, you have another man of color, Theo. So when you write your books, you write about all different kinds of characters, and a lot has changed in the last decade or so in terms of the conversation about taking on, especially white writers taking on these types of characters. So what was your process like? Did you have any hesitation in doing this, and kind of how did you go through this?
Oh my gosh, when I realized where this book had to go, I went down to the kitchen and I poured myself an adult beverage. No, I am not unaware, obviously, and I'm not out of sympathy with the arguments about appropriation and who should tell the story. But for me, it was like, okay, for 5 minutes, I had a cowardly thought. I thought, I can center this book on the white owners and nobody will have a problem with that. And they're pretty interesting, these guys. I mean, they're very colorful characters. All kinds of very strange people were involved with this horse. And then I thought, that is really cowardly because that will be erasing the contribution of the Black Horseman again. So I knew if I was going to write this book, I would have to go right at that, and I would have to do the work and try as best as I could to do justice to that story. And then once I realized that I had a contemporary story running parallel with the historical story, I couldn't leave the story of race and injustice in the 19th century as if, well, that's all over and done with, and we don't have to bother our pretty heads about that now, because obviously it's not over. And as I was writing this book, the thunder of the issue was incredibly loud because George Floyd was murdered and Breonna Taylor was shot in her own house and Ahmaud Arbery was murdered, and names and names and names of Black people dying at the hands of authority. And so I knew that I would have to go there in the contemporary story, and that there would have to be a resonance and a dialogue between the two periods. And that was very, I would not have been able to do that without the generosity of Black friends who shared their lived experience and gave me a ton of advice and put red lines through stupid things that I wrote. And just, and so I'm lucky that I live on Martha's Vineyard. I've lived there for getting on for 20 years now, and that has had a vibrant Black community for more than 100 years. And so in the main part, it's a pretty privileged community. But I've learned one thing from Black Friends on Martha's Vineyard, and that is that no amount of education or wealth or privilege or even celebrity protects you. And almost every friend, I think every friend I have has a terrible story of terror or humiliation. And I think everybody in this tent probably remembers a quite famous one. My summer neighbor, Henry Louis Gates, Harvard professor, TV star, hauled off his own porch in handcuffs 3 minutes after the policeman arrived because a racist neighbor had seen a black man committing the crime of opening his own front door. And so, you know, you hear those stories, and I tried to be as faithful to that experience as I could be. And, you know, I'm just really lucky that people were patient with me while I was doing this. And, you know, because there's nothing more tedious for Black people to have to sit down and explain to white people their own racism. So, and I learned a lot.
You've written about the Civil War before. You wrote about it in March. And your husband, Tony Horowitz, wrote a book that cited frequently Confederates in the Attic. He passed away while you were in the research or in the writing?
No, I'd written about half the book.
Okay. And I know you dedicate the book to him. Do you want to talk a little bit about how that affected the book?
Oh, well, it affected it enormously. In the immediate aftermath, he died very suddenly. He was on book tour for his book, Spying on the South. And we had done a lot of research together because he writes nonfiction, and he said when I started writing fiction, I'd gone over to the dark side. But we had some parallel characters and time periods in Kentucky. He was following the trail of Frederick Law Olmsted, who, before he became the celebrated landscape architect of Central Park, when he was a young man, he was actually a reporter for the New York Times. And they had sent him to the South to travel around and try and answer the question about why the country was so divided. And Tony had decided to retrace that journey and ask the same question. And he was actually here in San Antonio doing that research. And he had a great time here and made a lot of friends. But we traveled together in Kentucky, and he loved this book, and he stiffened my spine when I was worried about whether I could do it or not, and, you know, kept my feet to the fire. He would see me procrastinating and come in and say, "Oh, horse, not exactly galloping to the finish line today." So he died very suddenly, and I wasn't able to think about anything to do with the book for about a year. But I got some advice, and it came weirdly and indirectly from Ruth Bader Ginsburg through a friend of mine who was a reporter, and she had had a big loss in her life. And Ruth Bader Ginsburg had said, "Do your work. It might not be your best work, but it will be good work, and it will be what saves you." And so I took that advice, and I crawled back to my desk, and it turned out that it was true, that was the lifeboat that I crawled into. And I knew I had to finish the book because Tony had helped me with it so much, and he had believed in it. So I wanted to finish it so I could dedicate it to him. But after I finished the book, and when people started to read it, they said, "You know, the second half of this book is very different." And it is very different because I was different. And I think a lot of what happens in the second half of the book is a reflection of my own grief at the time.
So I think we might be out. We have time for any questions. We do. We have time for just maybe one or two questions, or maybe three. Oh, more. Okay. So if you could keep them brief, we have, she has a microphone. So if you want to raise your hand.
And you can ask questions, comments, abuse.
I'm wondering why you chose to write about the painter Scott in the first person. I think he's the only character you wrote in the first person.
Yeah, he is the only character I wrote in the first person, and I like to write in the first person, but I wrote him in the first person because he wrote a lot. So I could hear his voice very clearly, and I felt a lot of confidence about his voice. He wrote for the racing papers of the day, and also he was written about a lot because he was quite a character. He became a volunteer medic in the Civil War. He was with a volunteer unit of Kentuckians who fought on the Union side. And people wrote about him, so I had a very clear picture of him, and they wrote about his character. And because I had him in his own words, so I was able to write him in the first person with some confidence.
Any other questions? Okay.
Do you continue your interest in horses to this day?
I have a horse, and in fact, her name is Valentine, and I keep her with my neighbor's horse, who is an off-the-track racehorse called Screaming Hot Wings. And I have to tell you, Screaming Hot Wings just celebrated his 34th birthday. Yeah. And this raises a point because we've done terrible things to thoroughbreds. We have, in the quest for speed above all, we've made them frail. And most thoroughbreds, if they don't make it very, very quickly on the racetrack, they're discarded. And when I look at Screaming Hot Wings and his long life, he came off the track when he was a 5-year-old. And he became my neighbor's eventing horse. And you have to be completely insane to be an eventer, and she is a little insane. But then he became the teacher of generations of kids. And when we had Screaming Hot Wings' 34th birthday party in our backyard 2 weeks ago, there are women with their own kids now who learn to ride on Screaming Hot Wings. So we need to do a way better job with animal welfare in the racing industry.
Did you have a question?
I had a question about a character in the book that drove me crazy, and I want to know if he was based on fact. Tenbrook.
Tenbrook is absolutely based on fact. What a character. And of course, his life goes on beyond the scope of this novel, because once he sold Lexington, I didn't have an excuse to write about him anymore. But he went to England and he started palling around with the Prince of Wales, and he made and lost fortunes. And he came back to the United States and died in abject poverty. In fact, the guy who found him dead, alone in his bed in a bungalow in California, had come to buy his racing trophies because that was the last thing he had to sell. So yeah, he was something. And I went all the way to West Point to find out why he got thrown out of West Point. And I didn't know. And I thought, you could have told me that before I schlepped here.
My question is, you've written several really exquisite historical novels, and I wonder what you think fictionalizing history offers the reader.
So I'm only looking for stories where research won't provide the answer, because if we can know, I think you should give it to a historian, give it to a narrative historian. Like, if Jarrett had kept a journal and we knew what it was like to be him, then a narrative historian could tell that story. But unfortunately, we don't. And so that's where imagination has to step in. So what I'm looking for are stories from the past that are so implausible that if you made them up, it wouldn't be so interesting. Like a better example probably is my book, Caleb's Crossing, which is based on the true story of the first Native American graduate of Harvard. And he was a youth who was raised on Martha's Vineyard in the Wampanoag culture and language. Yet by the time he was 14, he had mastered Latin and Greek. And he went off and graduated with the sons of John Eliot and the other colonial Puritan elite. And if I made that character up, nobody would be interested. They'd say, you know, that's BS. But he actually lived. But we don't know what it was like to have his experience and be him. So I'm looking for what Mark Twain said, fiction is obliged to stick to possibilities, truth isn't. So I'm looking for these implausible truths where you can know something but you can't know everything.
I'm always interested in authors' selection of titles, and I can't help but wonder, was horse what you always thought it would be from the beginning, or did you toy with others?
I always wanted it to be called Horse. I had to fight the publishers. They wanted it to be called something else. But to me, that was part of what attracted me to the story, because at that very first meeting with the gentleman from the Smithsonian Institution, he told the story of how this skeleton came to the Smithsonian in the 19th century because Lexington was a celebrity. People loved this horse and wanted to see the skeleton of this powerful, fast racehorse. But over time, Lexington's celebrity waned, and also the Smithsonian's mission changed from being a cabinet of curiosities to being a scientific research institution. And at that point, Lexington isn't Lexington anymore. He's an example of Equus caballus, and he's in the Hall of Mammals alongside the skeleton of a rat and a rabbit and an antelope, and he just becomes horse. So I thought it was appropriate to use that title.
So I thought we were running out of time, so I have time for a few more of my own questions. Yay. So when you were just answering her question about the importance of historical research with these types of stories, how are you feeling right now when there's such a big movement and a push toward erasing those stories, and especially from from the enslaved, the Civil War we set out to tell in Horse? It feels like there's a push that we should not be exposed to these.
This is nuts. Absolutely crazy. And, you know, I'm sorry. I'm on the board of the Society of American Historians. I don't know why they elected me, but they did. But one of the things that we are concerned about is the impoverishment of the teaching of history in our schools. And I just go back to what Eleanor Roosevelt said. She said, learn your history, learn all of it. It will make you love your country more. Because you have to recognize the failures, the imperfections, the tragedies of the past. You have to confront it, and to say that, oh, we shouldn't make our children uncomfortable. I'm sorry, that is belittling our children's intelligence, and it is impoverishing our future.
And when COVID hit, I thought a lot about your book, Year of Wonders, about the plague in 1666, and it really resonated with me. I mean, a book I read when it came out in 2001 or so.
Yeah.
So I'm trying to do math. 19 years later, I thought a lot about that book, and I was so grateful that I had read it, because I felt like it gave me more of an insight into what was happening. And I feel that way reading Horse. There's a passage when you're talking about, I don't want to give anything away for anyone who hasn't read it, but you have a character who at one point is sympathetic toward the rebel prisoners of war, is that right? Or the rebels themselves. Yeah. And you write, he decides he doesn't feel that way anymore, because they were, all of them, lost to a narrative untethered to anything he recognized as true. Their mad conception of Mr. Lincoln as some kind of cloven-hoofed devil's scion, their complete disregard, denial of the humanity of the enslaved, their fabulous notions of what evils the federal government intended for them should their cause fail, all of it was ingrained so deep beyond the reach of a reasonable dialogue or evidence. He had become convinced that a total obliteration of their rebellion was the only way forward. I read that. I'm wondering how you felt as you were writing it, and I think I'm getting a sense of that just listening to you answer.
Yeah, well, you know, this was very much what my husband Tony was working on, was looking at the way we were pulling apart, siloing ourselves from each other, and having, you know, our own set of facts, but they're not facts, you know. And I'm sorry, as an Australian, I feel very guilty for having sent Rupert Murdoch. we should have locked him up early in the piece before he unleashed this kind of incredible divisiveness where we can't even agree that it's a bad thing that a 21-year-old just put a whole bunch of secret documents out on a gaming website. We're even arguing about that. You know, I mean, every single thing now has to become an argument. If you believe, if you're on one side of politics, you must believe that the other side is a cloven-hoofed devil, and this is very destructive to democracy.
Agreed. So I'm going to switch a little bit to talk about the art in the book. So you focus on the art world. You talk a lot about the 1850s and then present day, but you also dive into the 1950s art scene through Martha Jackson a little bit and her connection with how she ends up with the portrait of the horse. So can you tell me a little bit about your art appreciation, what you learned, all of that?
So, as I told you at the beginning, I grew up in the inner city of Sydney, but I developed a desire to be a journalist at a very young age. I was only 8 years old, and I went to see where my dad worked. He was a proofreader on the newspaper, and I happened to get to his newspaper office right when the presses were rolling for the afternoon newspaper, and he took me down, and it was like a sensual barrage of noise and vibration, and the air was, you could taste the ink in the air. And as the papers spun across this huge space and started differentiating on the conveyor belt, he reached out and he grabbed one and he handed it to me, and it was warm. It was hot off the presses. And here's this 8-year-old looking down at the inky headlines and thinking, I'm the first person in my city who knows what's going on here right now, and I wanted to be part of that. So when it came time to go to college, I thought, what does a journalist need to know? So I read the paper, and I saw there's a lot of politics in it, and then I saw that there's a lot of cultural coverage. So I thought, got it, I'll do a double major in government and fine arts, and that will cover the waterfront. So I graduated 4 years later. I could tell you all about bicameral parliaments and the uses of tempera and Quattrocento Italian wall painting and the subconscious in Picasso, Kandinsky, and clay. And they hired me on the Sydney paper, and they sent me to the sports department. But what they wanted me to do in the sports department was be an assistant to the racing writers. So finally, in this book, I finally get to unite what I learned being a lowly peon, following around the racing writers, taking down details on every horse in every race, with my love of fine arts and painting.
A character we haven't talked about is Jess. She's Australian. She found herself here in America. Can you talk just briefly about why you decided to make her Australian, visiting or living here?
So I had all these characters that I had to rely on other people to help me imagine and get right. And I thought, give yourself a break. Have one character that you know really well. So Jess is essentially me. She comes here for graduate school. She's very blockheaded and unaware of a lot of the social nuances. And she's kind of a weird nerd, and that was exactly me. And I did, yes, find an electrocuted bat and articulate it for my school project.
Can you tell us what you're working on next?
Yeah, I'm almost finished a very short memoir, which is about what happened when my husband died so suddenly and how absolutely our society has become completely incapable of giving people what they need to grieve. It was just a terrible year, or modern life is a bunch of people juggling flaming torches, basically. And in a marriage, you have your set of flaming torches. I juggled my set and he juggled his set. And when he died, I am trying to catch those torches so that our life doesn't fall apart. And it led to, our health insurance was canceled. I couldn't get a credit card. All kinds of crazy stuff that you don't want to be thinking about. You just want to, throw a black veil over your head and lie on the bed, but you can't, because the torches will hit the stage and the whole thing will go up in flames. So I just wanted to get that off my chest. And then I've got another historical novel to write after that.
Okay, wonderful. Do we have any more time? Are we out of time? We're out of time. So head to the signing tent. Thank you so much, Geraldine Brooks.
Thank you, Kathy.